The nation mourns the loss of several service members after a lone gunman kills 4 Marines and a Navy officer this week in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
At this point, we don't have anything that directly ties him to an international terrorist organization.
Police say the gunman was not on their radar. Are homegrown terrorists evolving? And how can law enforcement keep America safe? Let It Rip starts right now.
And time to let it rip. Joining us now to discuss is Dawud Walid, the Executive Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations.
And next to him is Dr. Richard Chesney, a counterterrorism expert and professor at Walsh College. All right, Dr. Chesney. All right, let's start. I want to start with you. We're talking about lone gunmen, but this guy seemed to have planned this. He had guns. He's been to the Middle East. Do you think that there's more to this gunman than just a lone gunman?
Well, at this point, we don't know. From what authorities are telling us, that there's no evidence of any formal link to ISIS or ISIL or other terrorist organization. But that begs the question of this issue of inspiration, that many lone wolf terrorists receive inspiration through the internet. And the question is not how much internet material is out there, so much as what type of resilience is available within an individual and how an individual reacts to the type of issues under consideration. Now,
isn't ISIS, I mean, one of their big deals is to put things out on the,
yes,
the internet. That's how they operate.
That is true. And I don't think it's fair to say that there's a formal link, given that information, between this individual and ISIS. Having said that, this is true, that one of the tactics that is used is certainly to have inspirational messages on the internet.
And, and this is being looked at as a possibility of domestic terrorism. A lot to this, but Dawud, once again, turns out this man is Muslim, and that's the first thing that people looked at and pointed out when this attack took place. Do you think that this was a faith-based, motivated attack? And how does it make you feel when every time something like this happens, they turn straight to religion?
Well, I'm not 100% sure if this was faith motivated or not, but what we can draw parallels between this and what Aaron Alexis did 2 years ago at the U.S. Navy Yard in D.C. He fatally shot 12 people, and he was suffering from mental illness, just like this young man was diagnosed with severe depression. He wasn't taking medication properly. He had already been turned down for a job for failing a drug test for marijuana. He had just recently been arrested for DUI. So, like, smoking weed and getting your drink on is not a trademark of a so-called faithful Muslim, much less an ISIS.
But
or Al-Qaeda
it goes
type.
back to the internet, though.
Yeah,
However, it was reported that there was an Islamic verse that was included in an email that was sent to a friend of his, and they're still trying to determine whether there's relevance in terms of that Islamic verse, which essentially talks about what to do with an enemy, within the context of this particular case. So it's not clear.
Let's go back to a larger issue, what Taryn brought up, and sometimes the double standard of how we discuss these things. Now, Dylan Roof, not long ago, fatally shot and killed 9 people. The FBI director wouldn't even say it was going to be investigated as being terrorism. We have an issue in which we have 5 U.S. Marines that were killed, and then the automatic discussion goes to terrorism and looking at background. This guy, if you want to look at killing someone based upon political motivations and what he said, then Dylan Roof clearly should be have been treated and should be treated right now as a terrorist. But he's a white male and he's a Christian.
Well, and certainly racism was a big role in that. But one thing that I think that was the red flag is that Allah had come up. And what you were talking about with the post, he said, life is short and bitter and the opportunity to submit to Allah may pass you by. That was one of the posts by
whether someone is motivated to commit acts of violence for secular reasons or whether they invoke religion, terrorism is still terrorism. And the majority of domestic terrorism that takes place in the United States of America, we don't talk about who the actual perpetrators are.
Even on the radar.
We have to distinguish what types of terrorism. Scholars talk about psychotic terrorism and criminal terrorism, far-right terrorism, and secular terrorism, and other forms of terrorism to give us a better understanding of the phenomenon.
This guy wasn't even on the
That's
radar.
correct.
though.
Right, the
Not
country
on the
didn't even
radar.
know anything about him. How could we protect ourselves if we don't know if he's not even on any sort of terror list?
Well, we have a society where, first of all, it's extremely easy for people to purchase guns. This guy was living the Southern culture. He was known to go to gun ranges. He was known to shoot just like how other young people do. And we have an issue or problem in our country that when people have mental illness, that people with mental illness still have, who are diagnosed as having serious mental problems, are still able to have access, purchase, and own guns. This is a bigger issue that needs to be.
Well, Dawud is correct when it comes to labeling the act in Charleston, South Carolina, as an act of terrorism. He's absolutely correct. What usually happens with respect to how an act of terrorism, which should be labeled an act of terrorism, if it's labeled or not labeled as terrorism, it's a politically driven issue. And yet at the same time, I think we also have to think about the proliferation of guns. Dawud is also correct that the proliferation of small arms, which is a worldwide problem as well as a U.S. problem, is something we have to deal with.
Why didn't the recruiters have guns? They don't have guns? Isn't that, I mean, might that have
There was a
been
New York
prevented?
Times report that essentially said that, and I'm not
recruitment
convinced
centers,
of this,
they don't have
that
guns.
having
They don't have
guns.
that having guns would somehow scare away potential recruits coming in, which doesn't sound terribly
Yeah, but
persuasive
doesn't
to
anybody
me.
strike the target here was military. In our country, military that recruits people, Americans presumably, or others, to become part of our military. Doesn't that smack of some terrorist? It's a subtle terrorist.
But you know, from the other side, under international law, you could make the argument that this was a military target.
That's right.
There's a gray area here. There's a gray area whether military recruiting stations actually fall under the heading of an active military target.
And we're looking at video right now, but then time and time again, if these people, if the argument was, if they were armed, if these recruiters were armed, because they're not allowed to be at this particular point, they've been gun-free zones for a long time, they would have been able to fight back. Do we know that? Were they just sitting ducks?
That would have helped because there was a drive-by. They're sitting inside at their desk, and them being armed wouldn't have stopped this at all. These types of issues, if someone wants to do a drive-by and shoot
the
for
other
any
center,
reason,
though, as well.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a problem. But again, I was a veteran in the United States military. It's just not protocol to have people who are not in combat zones or not on posts, on security, to just have everyone in U.S. military packing 40 calibers or packing shotguns.
They're
That's
soft targets. These military, let's leave aside the Naval Marine Station for a minute and talk about the recruiting center targets. They're soft targets. And essentially there have to be augmented security measures, and many governors through executive orders now in different states are, with greater or lesser intensity, putting those in place.
Again, I don't take this the wrong way again, but do you think, though, that Muslims have a bad PR going on? Even when we're bringing this topic up, there may not be any connection whatsoever to an organized terrorist or ISIS, but it's being discussed. How does it make you feel as a Muslim person?
I think it's being framed incorrectly. I think if we talk about mass shootings in America, gun violence, and also domestic terrorism, if we're looking at actually who is committing violence in the United States of America, Muslims are not by any stretch of the imagination committing anywhere close to the vast majority of overwhelming violence in America, but it seems to be
the ones that
framed
people are
that
talking
way.
about.
Yeah.
And would this be going on, though, Dr. Chasdi, these particular attacks, if ISIS wasn't out there recruiting these people on social media, targeting the disenfranchised, the depressed?
It doesn't have to be ISIS. It can be several terrorist groups.
Is our country doing enough, though, to fight ISIS?
There are, yes. I think that authorities are well aware of the problem and are doing the best they can, but what they're dealing with is a medium that's essentially a free medium. And this gets into the larger debate about whether there should be, and some people believe this, restrictions on the internet or not. But that's in some ways a different issue. But I would take a middle ground with my colleague Dawud here, that there is a context in terms of ISIS specifically asking individuals who are sympathetic with the ISIS cause to target American military targets. And having said that, and given the Islamic phraseology that's been used, I think there's a reasonable assumption that there is some connection,
Right.
however solid or not, in terms of this.
Well, as we wrap up, it seems like there is one underlying thing with all of these attacks. They are extremists, whatever religion that it seems to be, whether it's Christian or Muslim, whatever. It's anybody who takes something way too far, and I think you would both agree with that.
That is correct, I think.
Extremism and mental health problems, mental
As
health
well.
issues.
And the
Not a good
proliferation of
combination.
guns.
Definitely not.
Not a good
All right, thank you
combination.
both, Dawud and Dr. Chesney, and let us know what you think about